On the night Marilyn Monroe left this world, one question echoed louder than any headline. Who was she really? For decades, the world has repeated the same images: the white dress, the red lips, the breathless laugh, as if the woman beneath them never existed. But behind the most famous smile in Hollywood lay a life far more haunting, far more brilliant, and far more misunderstood than the legend ever revealed. Long before she became the brightest star in the sky, Marilyn was a girl who grew up in the shadows, shaped by abandonment and silence. She learned to survive by inventing light, a light so dazzling it blinded everyone who looked at her. Studios tried to own it, lovers tried to tame it, the world tried to define it, but none of them ever truly understood the fire they were trying to hold. Marilyn wasn't simply acting on screen. She was fighting for air, crafting a version of herself strong enough to withstand the weight of her past. And yet, even as she conquered Hollywood, there were two Marilyns living inside her: the icon millions adored, and the woman who spent her nights searching for peace in a world that refused to let her rest. Every photograph, every headline, every whisper hid a deeper truth, one that followed her all the way to her final night in Brentwood, where unanswered questions still linger like smoke. This is not the Marilyn Monroe you think you know. This is the woman behind the myth, the survivor, the dreamer, the fighter, the lover, the rebel, and the fragile heart Hollywood never protected. Her story is not just glitter and tragedy. It is a constellation of secrets, struggles, and brilliance that refuse to dim. And once you see her clearly, you may never see Marilyn the same way again. Before Marilyn Monroe became the most photographed woman on the planet, she lived a childhood shaped not by opportunity, but by absence. She entered the world on June 1, 1926, not as a symbol, not as a promise, but as a mystery. Norma Jeane Mortensen, later renamed Baker, was born into a life already marked by instability. Her mother, Gladys Pearl Baker, struggled with severe emotional difficulties that often left her disconnected from reality, drifting between fragile moments of clarity and long stretches of darkness. Norma Jeane never knew her father. The blank space on her birth certificate became the first unanswered question in a life that would one day be filled with them. When she was only a baby, her mother's world collapsed, forcing social workers to intervene and place the child in the first of many foster homes. That temporary placement became the beginning of a long, winding journey through more than 10 different households, each with its own rules, personalities, and unpredictable attachments. She learned early that love could vanish without warning, that the word home was something other children had while she merely visited it. The instability forged a resilience in her, but it also carved deep emotional wounds that would echo throughout her adult life. One of the most formative places she lived was the Los Angeles Orphans' Home, where she stayed for over a year. There, she shared crowded dormitories with dozens of girls, all of them yearning for a sense of belonging. Norma Jeane developed a habit of watching people with careful attention, as if studying them would reveal the secret to being wanted. She learned to smile when she was afraid, to appear calm when she felt lost, and to charm those around her in hopes of securing a little more kindness. These early learned behaviors later became part of the charisma the world mistook for confidence. She found brief stability with the Goddards, a warm couple who offered her more affection than she had ever known. Yet even this sanctuary could not last. When the family moved across the country and could not legally take her with them, the 13-year-old girl was once again left behind. That abandonment cut deeply, reigniting the fear that she would always be someone people eventually left. As Norma Jeane grew into adolescence, she faced challenges no young girl should confront. Her sense of safety was fragile, her boundaries often ignored, and her formative years were shaped by experiences that left lasting emotional scars. She learned to protect herself by withdrawing inward and building dreams far bigger than the walls around her. The fantasy of Hollywood, with its bright lights and beautiful illusions, became the distant refuge she clung to. At 16, she faced a devastating crossroads: return to the state-run orphanage or get married. The choice was not truly a choice at all. She married James Doherty, a quiet, older neighbor who provided stability but not love. It was a marriage of necessity, not desire, a lifeline she took out of fear of being institutionalized again. Yet even in that constrained life, something inside her refused to dim. While her husband went to work each day, she daydreamed about acting, modeling, escaping the smallness of the world around her. Those who knew her then described a young woman who carried sadness in her eyes, but determination in every step. She was fragile, yet unbreakable, insecure, yet fiercely ambitious. These contradictions would define her forever. Long before Marilyn Monroe existed, this fragile teenager had already begun building the armor she would need to survive fame, heartbreak, and the relentless spotlight that awaited her. The shadows of her childhood shaped her, but they never defeated her. They created the woman the world would one day call unforgettable. When Norma Jeane stepped onto her first studio lot, Hollywood barely noticed her. She was shy, soft-spoken, and carried herself with the cautious grace of someone who had survived a childhood where every step could shift the ground beneath her feet. But behind her quiet presence was a spark, something untrained, unshaped, but undeniably luminous. It was this spark that a military photographer saw when he visited the radio plane factory during World War II, searching for images to boost morale. While other workers blended into the machinery, Norma Jeane stood out, her face glowing with a kind of vulnerable radiance he knew the camera would adore. His photographs opened a door she had long dreamed of, but never dared to push. Modeling came naturally to her. She understood instinctively how to hold her body, how to tilt her chin, how to let the light kiss her features. But more importantly, she understood emotion. Every photograph carried a hint of longing, playfulness, melancholy, or wonder, expressions drawn not from training, but from her own life. Soon, magazines began to take notice. Her face appeared on covers, then inside studio offices, then on shortlists for screen tests. It was not fame yet, but it was hope. When 20th Century Fox finally signed her, the transformation began immediately. The executives believed they knew what the public wanted, and they intended to sculpt her into it. Norma Jeane's brown curls were cut and dyed into the now legendary platinum blonde. Her name was reinvented into the elegant, dreamy Marilyn Monroe. Her natural softness was reshaped into a crafted persona, the girl who could light up any room with a breathless laugh and a slow, shimmering smile. She accepted these changes not because she lacked identity, but because she recognized that to enter Hollywood, she needed armor, and this glamorous new image was her shield. Her first roles were small, often fleeting, a coquettish glance in one film, a line or two in another. Yet audiences noticed her, the way they notice flames in the dark. And Marilyn, determined not to be dismissed as a decoration, began studying relentlessly. She read every book she could find, philosophy, psychology, literature, and soon her private library grew into one of the most sophisticated collections owned by any actor of her era. She was not just beautiful. She was curious, thoughtful, and deeply aware of her craft. Then came Niagara, the film that changed everything. With its dramatic lighting and sensual intensity, the movie transformed Marilyn from a promising newcomer into a global phenomenon. She became the face of desire, the woman every magazine fought to feature, the name studio heads tossed around in every meeting. The world fell in love with the image, the walk, the voice, the innocence wrapped in seduction. But even as the icon rose, the woman behind it felt the weight of expectation. She knew that the industry valued her beauty far more than her talent, and she refused to accept that fate. In 1955, in a move almost unthinkable for a woman in that era, she created Marilyn Monroe Productions, her own company. It was a declaration of independence, a rebellion against the studios that tried to own her. She traveled to New York, enrolled at the Actors Studio under Lee Strasberg, and immersed herself in method acting with a hunger that surprised even her teachers. She wanted respect, artistry, depth, not just applause. The world saw Marilyn Monroe as a dream, a fantasy in soft focus. But she was more than the symbol they worshipped. She was a woman rebuilding herself from the pieces of her past, shaping her image as carefully as the studios did, yet driven by a desire they could not control, the desire to be real, to be heard, to be more than the world expected. Marilyn Monroe did not simply happen. She was made by others and by herself. And in that creation, she became unforgettable. As Marilyn's fame expanded into something larger than life, her longing for stability grew with equal intensity. She had spent her childhood searching for a family, a home, a single person who would stay. And when she met Joe DiMaggio, America's most celebrated baseball hero, the world believed she had finally found it. At first, Joe adored her with a devotion that bordered on worship. His admiration was genuine, powerful, and deeply emotional. But he fell in love with the quiet girl he imagined at home, not the luminous star the world chased. When Marilyn stood over the subway grate filming The 7-Year Itch, her white dress billowing toward the sky as crowds roared with excitement, Joe watched the scene unfold with a mixture of jealousy and helplessness. The moment that made her an eternal symbol became the moment their marriage began to fracture. The tension between them intensified quickly. Joe wanted a traditional wife. Marilyn wanted the freedom to pursue the dreams she had spent her life building. Their arguments grew sharper, and the weight of his expectations pressed against her desire to define her own identity. The marriage lasted only 9 months, but its emotional impact lingered far longer. And, despite everything, Joe would remain one of the few people who genuinely loved her beyond the spotlight. Her next marriage, to playwright Arthur Miller, was guided by intellect rather than glamour. Marilyn admired him deeply, his words, his mind, his ability to make sense of a world that often overwhelmed her. But their relationship carried its own shadows. Miller saw her brilliance, but also her fragility, and at times he struggled to reconcile the myth with the woman beside him. When Marilyn discovered personal notes where he expressed disappointment and frustration with her, the wound pierced her more deeply than any public criticism ever had. She had survived the world's judgment, but Miller's quiet disapproval nearly broke her heart. Complicating everything were Marilyn's unending struggles with health. The severe pain caused by endometriosis left her exhausted, desperately searching for relief. Studio doctors prescribed medications, sleeping pills, painkillers, anti-anxiety tablets, and she began relying on them to endure long hours on set and sleepless nights at home. The combination created cycles of dependence that grew stronger with each passing year. She was not reckless, she was exhausted. The pressure of being Marilyn Monroe, the global symbol, the idealized fantasy, demanded a perfection that no human could sustain. It was during this turbulent period that she became intimately involved with President John F. Kennedy, a connection charged with desire, secrecy, and an intoxicating sense of danger. Marilyn felt drawn to him not just because he was powerful, but because he represented the warmth, charm, and validation she had sought since childhood. Their encounters were electric, layered with both genuine emotion and the thrill of forbidden intimacy. Later, she also grew close to Robert F. Kennedy, whose calm presence and serious demeanor contrasted sharply with his brother's playful charisma. These relationships became some of the most controversial and misunderstood chapters of her life, woven into a labyrinth of politics, passion, and speculation that would follow her to her final day. Fame had given her everything she once dreamed of, and yet it amplified every fear she carried. She was adored by millions, but lonely in ways few could comprehend. She was powerful on screen, yet vulnerable behind closed doors. She was desired by presidents and worshipped by audiences, yet still the same girl who had once waited for anyone to choose her and stay. Marilyn's life at the height of her stardom was a symphony of applause layered over a storm of heartbreak. The world saw the radiance. Only a few saw the cost. By the early 1960s, Marilyn Monroe stood at a strange crossroads. She was one of the most famous women alive. Her image printed on posters, magazines, billboards, postcards, and calendars. The world adored her, but the relentless pressure of maintaining that perfect version of herself had begun to erode the ground beneath her feet. Hollywood demanded she always be radiant, always be flawless, always embody the dream they had created. Yet Marilyn, with her painful health issues, chronic exhaustion, and emotional storms intensified by years of medication, struggled to keep pace with the myth that bore her name. Her days often began with pills to wake up, pills to calm anxiety, pills to manage pain, and pills to sleep. Studio doctors normalized this cycle, insisting it was the only way to meet the impossible demands placed on her. They didn't see her vulnerability. They saw a lucrative investment that needed to be kept functional at all costs. The more pressure she faced, the more she relied on medication just to feel steady enough to move forward. This dependence did not come from recklessness, but from survival. Her body and mind were overwhelmed, and she grasped for anything that could quiet the storm inside her. Her marriage to Arthur Miller was deteriorating, leaving her emotionally unmoored. She felt abandoned, misunderstood, and increasingly isolated in the mansion they once shared so hopefully. The expectations of audiences, executives, paparazzi, and critics grew heavier. Even small missteps, arriving late to set, missing rehearsals, withdrawing when overwhelmed, became headlines, magnifying her struggles in the public eye. Then came the Breaking Point Psychiatric Clinic. Marilyn believed she was being admitted for rest and therapeutic support, but the moment the heavy door locked behind her, she realized she had been placed in a ward designed for severe psychiatric cases. The walls were bare, the windows reinforced, and the staff treated her as if she were dangerous rather than fragile. Panic surged through her. She pounded on the door, shouting to be heard, begging for someone to understand that she didn't belong there. Instead of comfort, she received cold detachment. Instead of care, she was met with suspicion. This was one of the most traumatic experiences of her life. Later, she would describe how she felt trapped, terrified, and utterly alone. Not as a glamorous star, not as Marilyn Monroe, but as Norma Jeane once again, the abandoned child no one believed, locked away without a voice. Her saving grace came unexpectedly, Joe DiMaggio. Despite all their past turmoil, he remained one of the few people who loved her without expecting anything in return. When Marilyn managed to send word to him, Joe flew to New York immediately, stormed into the hospital, and demanded her release with a fury that left the staff stunned. His intervention worked. For the first time in years, someone had fought for her instead of exploiting her. But the damage had been done. The Payne Whitney incident left her shaken, vulnerable, and more distrustful of her surroundings. It also deepened her dependence on medication as she tried to quiet the echoes of that experience. Professionally, she faced another blow soon after. Her frequent absences from set, often caused by her health issues and overwhelming anxiety, led 20th Century Fox to fire her from Something's Got to Give, the film meant to be her grand comeback. It was a humiliating moment, splashed across newspapers around the world. Yet ironically, when the studio saw the public backlash and the undeniable financial draw of her name, they begged her to return, offering a renewed contract and a public reconciliation. Hollywood wanted Marilyn back, but the woman they wanted no longer existed in the same way. Her spirit had been battered, her trust shattered, and her strength worn down by years of emotional turbulence. She was still luminous, still iconic, still capable of captivating the world with a single glance. But behind that glow was a woman trying desperately to hold herself together as everything around her seemed determined to fall apart. In the summer of 1962, Marilyn Monroe was living alone in her Brentwood home, surrounded by scripts, photographs, medicine bottles, and phone numbers scribbled in her looping handwriting. On the surface, this was a quiet period. No film shooting, no red carpets, no studio executives calling. But beneath that stillness was a woman attempting to rebuild herself yet again. She had regained her role in Something's Got to Give, and for the first time in months, she felt a spark of hope. She spoke to friends about future projects, upcoming photo shoots, and her desire to step back into the industry with a stronger sense of control. The comeback seemed possible. Yet the world around her was increasingly chaotic. Her relationships with President John F. Kennedy via Robert F. Kennedy had woven her into a web of politics, secrecy, and emotional intensity. These connections, once intoxicating, had become sources of turmoil. The brothers were powerful, admired, and deeply charismatic, but they lived in a world where Marilyn could never truly belong. She had hoped for affection, for permanence, for something stable. Instead, she found herself entangled in a situation where she was both desired and dismissed, central and yet disposable. It left her feeling exposed, confused, and emotionally raw. Her physical health was also failing. Chronic pain from endometriosis was worsening, sleep was elusive, and her reliance on prescribed medication grew heavier. Doctors tried to manage her condition, but the demands placed on her body and mind were relentless. Long nights blurred into early mornings, often interrupted by calls, visitors, or her own racing thoughts. She was exhausted, not carelessly, but in the way someone becomes tired after years of carrying a weight far too heavy. On August 4th, 1962, Marilyn spent the day making phone calls to friends, her psychiatrist, and her publicist. Many described her as reflective but calm, even hopeful. She showed interest in future plans, discussed redecorating her home, and talked about new career opportunities. Nothing about her behavior that day suggested she was preparing for the kind of tragedy that would soon stun the entire world. Late that night, something shifted. The events of the final hours remain a patchwork of testimony, speculation, conflicting timelines, and missing details. The official report stated that Marilyn passed away from acute barbiturate poisoning, but almost every aspect of the investigation left room for questions. Why were certain phone records missing? Why were some witness statements contradictory? Why was the toxicology incomplete? Why did reports about who entered the house and when change in the days that followed? Rumors swirled almost immediately. Political involvement, cover-ups, accidental over-medication, hidden visitors, silenced secrets. The presence of the Kennedy brothers in her life only intensified public fascination. Although no definitive evidence emerged to support any single theory, the sheer number of discrepancies became the fuel for decades of debate. Her final night became less a moment in time and more a legend, debated, dissected, reinterpreted, and mythologized. Through the noise of speculation, one truth stood steady. Joe DiMaggio was the one who stepped forward, quietly, steadfastly, without the cameras he despised. He claimed her body, arranged her funeral, and barred every Hollywood elite who had exploited her. His love for her, imperfect, turbulent, but undeniably real, revealed itself most clearly in death. For 20 years, twice a week, he sent roses to her crypt, a silent promise he kept long after the world had moved on. Marilyn Monroe left behind no final statement, no farewell, no explanation. She left a question, one that has lived longer than the woman herself. Her final night remains an unfinished chapter suspended between fact and folklore. What is certain is this: Marilyn Monroe did not fade. She transformed. And in that transformation, she became eternal. Marilyn Monroe's life has often been reduced to photographs, rumors, and the shimmering silhouette the world chose to remember. But behind the myth was a woman who fought extraordinary battles long before she ever stepped in front of a camera. She was not simply the blonde dream Hollywood invented, nor the fragile figure whispered about in tabloids. She was the child who endured a fractured beginning, the young woman who reshaped herself through sheer will, and the artist who demanded respect in an industry that preferred her silent and smiling. Her story is both heartbreaking and magnificent, a reminder that the brightest light often casts the longest shadow. Marilyn rose higher than anyone of her time, carried by charisma, vulnerability, and an otherworldly presence that no studio could manufacture. Yet every ascent came with a cost. The pressure to remain flawless, the endless scrutiny, the emotional storms that intensified behind closed doors. All these forces shaped the woman the world thought it knew, but never truly saw. And still, she kept rising. Even when she stumbled, even when Hollywood doubted her, even when pain and confusion threatened to pull her under, she reached again for something better. Better roles, better love, better truth, better days. In her final years, she continued searching for the version of herself that existed beyond the spotlight, the one she hoped would finally be enough. Marilyn Monroe did not vanish into tragedy. She ascended into legend. Her laughter, her ambition, her mistakes, her brilliance, her longing all became part of a legacy that outlived everyone who judged or controlled her. She remains, even now, a symbol of beauty, resilience, and the complexity of being human in a world eager to simplify you. Her story is not a cautionary tale. It is a reminder. Even icons bleed, dream, hope, and break, and sometimes in that breaking, they become eternal.